Brad, I just want to tell you that you caused me a lot of trouble. I was at Stanford. I was at a debate with two feminist professors from the law school, and at one point I brought up your research on the importance of stable families, fathers, and its relation to the absence of fathers and the relation to poverty. As soon as I mentioned that fatherlessness was, a culture of fatherlessness was dysfunctional, there were gasps. The woman next to me, I was debating, this very reasonable, seemingly reasonable professor of law, she was horrified, and simply to mention your research, which seems quite sound to me, I triggered the audience, the whole audience. Have you met that reaction, or did I put it the wrong way? Well, you have no idea what I said, but I thought it was an accurate representation of your research.
Well, I think in some precincts of the academy and the public culture, talking about fatherhood as an important part of kids' lives is triggering. But I think it's also important to understand and to acknowledge that for sort of more mainstream scholars in psychology and sociology and economics, people like Belle Sawhill at Brookings, people like Sarah McClanahan at Princeton, people like Marion Bartrard at the University of Chicago, there is, I think, a recognition that fathers on average matter for their kids, and that communities that don't have lots of fathers are more likely to be struggling in important ways. So I think part of it's sort of how close you are to the data. Right. And scholars who are really close to the data, using large national data sets, understand that it's at least part of the picture that's worth focusing on, the role of fathers in parts of family structure.
And I think a lot of people just aren't aware that both liberal and conservative scholars
Sure.
are converging on this consensus
Right.
that a culture of fatherness is dysfunctional. Whereas, any child can come from a broken home and,
Sure.
and make admirable adjustments. But to have millions of children coming from such homes, for normalizing it, we haven't taken the time to look at the consequences. You have, and your colleagues have.
Sure.
What sort of things are you finding? For example, the relationship between poverty and fatherlessness.
Well, we know that families that are headed by married parents are less likely to be poor than families headed by single mothers. Single moms are about 5 times more likely, if they're heading up a family, to be poor compared to married parent families. So that's kind of one example of the way in which family structure is related to another key outcome that all of us are concerned about, whether we're on the left or the right. That is poverty, in families, poverty among kids. So we also been talking a lot of late about income inequality. And the data suggests there that about 1/3 of the increase in income inequality for families between the 70s and the 1990s was related to the retreat from marriage. The fact that fewer working class and poor families have a father in the picture, a married father in the picture, who would otherwise would have been contributing economically to those families. So that's increasing the economic divide between college-educated families who tend to be much more stable, more married, and working class and poor families who tend to be more likely to, today to be headed by a single parent, usually a single mother.
What do you say to critics who say, well, it's not that, if they get married, then everything will be rosy. They can't get married because they're poor. It's poverty. It's an absence of jobs that's creating the social havoc, and it doesn't allow them to get married, and that you're not looking at the root causes. What do you say to that?
Well, it's certainly the case that poverty is an issue, that issues related to men's involvement in the labor force, these are all major issues that help to explain why it is that working class and poor Americans are today less likely to get married. But that's not the whole story. And if we look just historically, for instance, at the 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, there was no dramatic increase in family instability, no dramatic increase in single parenthood, no dramatic increase in divorce. So, part of what's happening right now is that the sort of changes in our culture are interacting with changes in the economy in ways that make working class and poor relationships more fragile and less likely to either end in marriage or to kind of go the distance. So, class matters in all this, but also I think we have to acknowledge the ways in which sort of culture matters and changes in the culture matter.
Yeah, I know in our colleague Charles Murray, in his book Coming Apart, he mentioned how you go back to the 40s or 50s and you look at the wealthy, you look middle class and poor. And of course the wealthy had better things and had lived at a much higher level, prosperity, obviously. But in many other ways, there weren't exact same levels of marriage, but very close.
Yeah.
And family stability, and also connection to community. And that it appears that when you're married and staying with your family, there's more likelihood to be involved in schools and clubs and social
Right.
organizations. And that Charles mentions that today a lot of people say, oh, well, it's not Ozzie and Harriet anymore. Well, it appears that it is for the cognitive elite or the upper middle class. They do look rather like the 1950s, and their kids are benefiting from it. And then you look at people that are the lower middle class, poor, and there's not only the poverty, but also the social havoc, and kids not having the benefit of two parents. And you're seeing this.
Yeah, no, there's this growing class divide in American family life, and the irony is that well-educated Americans are often more progressive in theory on family issues, are when it comes to kind of their own marriages and the way that they sort of interact with their kids are, quite conventional in a kind of neo-traditional sense.
They don't preach what they practice, as Charles said.
Exactly. So there is this kind of walking right, talking left dynamic in play for some, for some elites. That it's noteworthy. But the deeper point here is that college-educated Americans have kind of figured out in important ways how to navigate this new world when it comes to their own families. And they also benefit, of course, from better incomes and more stable incomes. And so they're doing pretty well. And we've actually seen divorce rates come down in college-educated precincts since the 1980s. An example that I give is sort of Newt Gingrich versus Barack Obama. It's not a political point, it's sort of a generational point. Yeah. You can't really imagine someone in Obama's position having the kind of marital history that Newt Gingrich does. And so the point simply is that I think for many elites, their orientation towards marriage and family life kind of shifted in the late 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so they have kind of figured out that marriage matters for them and for their kids, and they're acting accordingly. Now, the challenge, of course, facing us as a country is, can we extend that wisdom and those insights to the broader country and help rebuild working class and poor marriages today as well?
Well, tell me about the impact of fathers on kids, and it's different for boys and girls. Like, what does it's fashionable in some circles to say, well, fathers or mothers, they're interchangeable. Sure. But common sense and maybe the entire anthropological record suggests that the roles are different. I've seen, just to give a mundane example, right. I've seen kids playing in the park, the child's on a climbing structure, and the mother will say, be careful, Timmy, and the dad will say, can you get to the top? Just that sort of thing. I think, most of us see that kids benefiting from both. And if you have only one parent, the other is not there. But typically it's the father. Sure. What do we know about the effects on girls and young women?
Well, it's interesting. When it comes to sort of thinking about the impact of dads on their daughters, what we see basically is that daughters are more likely to flourish educationally and even later on in life professionally when they've had an involved dad who's engaged with them in their lives. And so there's a way in which both fatherhood and marriage, done right, of course, are really today, I think, acting in service of the cause of women's progress. We have to. So my research, for instance, shows that young women who have come from an intact family are more likely to be flourishing in the labor market in their late 20s compared to young women who haven't had that in their background. So again, there's a way in which today girls and women benefit from having an active father.
And this is across class lines.
Across class lines. We also see too, when it comes to teen pregnancy, that women who have a father present are much less likely to become pregnant as teenagers, and women who have a close emotional relationship with their dad are much less likely to become pregnant as teenagers. So having both a father present in your life and having an engaged and affectionate dad in your life is a real resource for our girls here in the U.S.
And I remember, and I've tried to debate this sometimes with gender scholars, and they never say much about it, but isn't it protective for children, but particularly girls, with the father, the biological father in the home, the likelihood of violence or sexual predation, it increases exponentially when the dad's gone and you have a mother's live-in boyfriend. Is that, do you have, you've
Yeah,
talked
so
about
the U.S.
that.
Department of Health and Human Services publishes a report on a fairly regular basis on child abuse and child neglect. And they have a figure that sort of maps out or charts out the relationship between family structure and child abuse. So the physical abuse of kids, the sexual abuse of kids, and the emotional abuse of children. And they're actually combining boys and girls in this particular figure. And there's a very strong association between family structure and kids' safety on these three outcomes. And so kids who are being raised in an intact biological married family have much lower rates of abuse than kids in other arrangements. And the most risky place in America is where you have a biological parent and an unrelated adult. They don't specify how that's arranged, but that's typically the mom and an unrelated male boyfriend. That's a much riskier place for our kids. They're about 9 times more likely to be physically, sexually, or emotionally abused in those relationships or family contexts than kids who are being raised in intact married families. So that's just one indication of the way in which both, in this case, both girls and boys are safer from the scourge of child abuse, when they're being raised by their unmarried parents.
And I read in various reports, and I wrote about this in The War Against Boys, the latest edition, that boys from broken homes, especially poor boys, that this family instability has more adverse effect on boys than girls. The daughters are, for whatever reason, appear to be doing better educationally and vocationally.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's ironic that you had a colleague at Stanford who was an economist who was sort of concerned about this point about fathers because there's more evidence coming actually from economics, specifically, that is suggestive here. Raj Chetty at Stanford, Marianne Burchard at Chicago, especially David Autor at MIT, they're doing work that suggests that poor boys in particular are being hit hard by this retreat from marriage, that they're the ones who are most likely to be suspended from school, for instance. And what's fascinating about David Autor's work is he's been doing some research with colleagues in Florida, and what they're finding is that sort of, generally speaking, boys are more likely to be suspended than girls in school, but the gap between boys and girls is much smaller for kids from more affluent families and much bigger for kids from poor families. And a substantial part of that story is the kids from poor families are more likely to have a single mother, at the head of that household. And
I read,
so basically not having the father in the household is one reason why poor boys, it looks like, based upon Autor's work, are more likely to be suspended from school.
Now, you've written about what fathers do for boys, even in terms of teaching them how to roughhouse.
Correct.
And how to control their,
bodies. Yeah.
Tell us a little about that.
So it's fascinating. When you think about, a dad roughhousing with his kids on Thursday night, maybe exasperating the mom. She's like, I'm trying to get these kids to bed, and here's, my husband on the floor wrestling with them, or on Saturday morning, wrestling with his toddlers. And you might think, what's the big deal? But what's interesting about this is that work by Ross Park, who is a psychologist at the University of California, indicates that this kind of rough and tumble play on the part of fathers helps kids develop, and that kids, both boys and girls, are more likely to be sort of doing well socially, be popular in their classes if they have lots of rough and tumble play with their father. And so I think the story here is that, having that experience with your dad, basically teaches kids to some extent how to control their emotions and their bodies, and then they kind of take that knowledge and they bring it with them into the classroom or onto the soccer field or the football field or to the playground.
And how to be rambunctious and playful without being violent.
Yeah, without being out of control. So like a kid
without
who's biting
control.
or whatever, kicking his father, and that
Right,
soon
bite
learns
the father.
that's not appropriate and that's not acceptable. And so
Right.
they're taking some life lessons from from the family room floor to their classroom and the playground and the soccer field.
So all of that would for the girl, she'll have a mother who's, so many single mothers are heroic and they're working so hard,
Sure.
and the kids love them and respect them, but the daughter also emulates her. And the son is less likely to emulate a mother, but more likely to look for a male role model. And if the father's not there, it'll be, well, we hope there's a surrogate, but if not,
Sure.
it would be friends, I guess, or peers.
Right, and so one of the things that David Autor is hypothesizing in his work, again, which is showing that poor boys are being hit particularly hard by fatherlessness in their communities. author who's at MIT again is thinking that what may be happening here is that poor boys are often in a situation where they don't have regular access to, in their own home, to a father who is, going to work every day and who is, involved as a husband and a father in the home, and so that may affect how they approach school, how they approach work down the road, and how they approach relationships as well. So again, not having that father might be particularly salient for boys for the reasons that author has suggested in his report. It's called Wayward Sons. It's well worth picking up on the internet.
I was very impressed by that and did mention it in some of my research. What about, I can imagine someone saying, well, the kind of fathers who remain married and stay in the home, they're just, they're more stable individuals. But you've actually shown, and others, that marriage and staying, with your kids, it changes the man.
Sure.
How does that work?
So, what you've been finding in the research is that men are transformed by marriage and by married fatherhood. So men who get married and stay married and who have kids in marriage tend to work longer hours. They tend to work more strategically. They're less likely to be fired, for instance, even controlling for a range of background characteristics. And they make more money. They
also live longer and they're healthier.
That's also true as well.
Because their wives make them go to the doctor, otherwise they won't.
And also they're less likely to be riding a motorcycle without a helmet, and less likely to be going to bars on Saturday night, all that kind of stuff. So when
more likely to be a little nagged, but
yes, right.
It's good for their health.
Long term, yes. There's a long-term benefit. So yeah, marriage has a kind of a big impact on men's lives. And work done by Harvard sociologists, for instance, suggests that this kind of marriage premium is highest among men who are married in intact, families with their kids in the household. So kind of having that motivation to provide for your kids seems to be a big factor for many men.
Yeah. So all of these things, we look at the benefits for women, and did we talk about that?
Well, it's important, I think, sort of point to hit on actually, because there was a time, in recent history when women would get married and they would pay a kind of marriage penalty for marriage. But what's fascinating is that today it's a new world. And so what we're seeing from a new study at Columbia University, for instance, is that we do know that women still have a motherhood penalty, that women are more likely to withdraw to some extent from the labor force when they have children. But what's fascinating is that married moms have a smaller penalty than unmarried moms do. And I think the story there probably is that the married moms, have a partner who's helping them navigate, the challenges of juggling work and family, maybe spelling them at certain times, or taking the kids at certain times, and having that husband in the picture, makes it easier for them to, to remain in the labor force. So the sort of classic concern that marriage was a kind of a patriarchal institution that kind of held women back, I think in some important respects needs to be revised, or maybe even dramatically revised in 2016.
So it's just another advantage that most, professional, highly educated, women have, and poorer women, that's just something else that's undermining their
right. So the way in which marriage is now much more common in some ways and more stable and secure in upper middle class homes only further advantages not just men and kids in those communities, but also women, it looks like today. On average. Of course, we have to talk about the exceptions, and we all know there are exceptions to the kinds of things I'm talking about today. It's also important to acknowledge that, many kids who are raised by, say, a single mother turn out just fine. In fact, most kids, raised by single moms turn out okay. I was raised by a single mom. I think my mom did a good job with me and my sister. We've turned out fine.
Oh, I read about you. You were a bit of a hell raiser. You threw your lunch pail across the cafeteria.
Yeah, that's true. I had a summer camp experience that was a little bit, yeah.
That and other things, because.
Yeah. But I got through that experience. So yeah, I think that it's important to acknowledge in all these debates and discussions that there are plenty of kids flourishing in non-traditional families. At the same time, though, as a sociologist, I would say that kids are more likely to struggle when they don't have the benefit of an intact married family.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that, because in in my family, not my immediate family, but extended family, and probably everyone's, there have been a lot of broken marriages and kids raised in different situations. And I look at some of these kids who did, in my opinion, turned out very well. I think what would have happened had their parents stayed together, and I think they would have been different. Sure. But I can't say for sure that they would be so much better. I mean, they had a hard time, some of them, but it also made them survivors. It made them sort of, they had, I mean, you look today at these helicopter parents in
Sure.
these upper middle class homes, and
Right.
some of the kids I'm seeing in college, and then you meet working class kids who had sort of a more difficult time, or even some of the kids in my family who had to be, you just wonder if there aren't some advantage. I mean, I don't want to say advantages because you wouldn't want to put someone
Sure.
through that, but on the other hand, a lot of those kids do seem, I don't know, seem to be a little more, I can't even say well adapted, but just ready to take on the world than these hyper
Yeah, no, I
kids.
think being raised by a single mother can, I think in some ways, for instance, that's my experience, can give you certain experiences that are challenging in ways that actually do prepare you kind of later in life for a tough scenario of one sort or another. But I think we have to sort of just acknowledge that on average, again, the sort of average story here is more risk for kids raised apart from the intact married families. Another important point here is—
That's a good point, though. It's a risk. It's not saying this will happen.
Right.
It just says, maybe 25% of kids are from broken homes are, going to
Right.
run into serious problem. The percentage is a lot lower.
And different kids experience family instability differently. There's a fascinating new study from my mentor at Princeton, Sarah McClanahan, looking at genes actually and father absence. And what she's finding is it looks like some boys have a kind of genetic risk for acting in an antisocial way. And it's those boys, not all boys, but those boys who are more likely to be affected on that outcome, when their dad's absent from the home. So again—
And but boys with that gene and the father's in the home,
the complex of genes that are related to this.
Hard
So
to
there's a
sort
way
it
in
out.
which there may be kind of interaction between nature and nurture here, so that some kids, again, are being affected more by, in this case, fatherlessness than other kids. And so other kids are going to be pretty resilient in the face of, different family configurations.